Hello and welcome to Murder Analysed. I'm Christina Moore. Now today's case is the Gary Ridgway case. You may know him as the Green River Killer. Prolific American serial killer. I think at the time when he was charged with the murders, I think it was 48 or 49, but now it's gone up to 52. So with further investigation, and I think with the help of Gary Ridgway, but it is thought that the probably total is up to 80, could even be more. So this man knows his trade, if you like to say, his skills. He was very good at it, and it took them 20 years to catch this man. So now let's think about the background. You know, what could turn someone like Ridgway to hate women so much that it become a serial killer and kill so many? Was there signs of something earlier on? There was actually, and as we go through this, there was signs, but also some of the behaviours, but not only the behaviours of him, the behaviours of his mother. And again, it comes into, when we're talking about serial killers and their backgrounds, about the part the mother plays in quite a lot of these serial killers. So Gary was born on the 18th of February 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah. Ridgway was the middle son, and again, this middle child syndrome comes up. So whether that plays any relevance, we don't know, because I think there's a lot in this case that could play or could have played a part in making this man a serial killer. So his mother was Mary Rita Steinman, and his father was Thomas Newton Ridgway. And at the age of 11, Ridgway and his family moved to Utah, Washington state. And this is where these crimes took place. So Ridgway struggled, I think, from an early age. He did poorly at school, and this is due to having dyslexia, which, don't forget, in 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s even, and even 90s, the dyslexia wasn't really understood. So in school, he was then bullied because he couldn't do the work, because he couldn't see it. He couldn't, like we know now with dyslexia, what can happen. So whether he had dyslexia where he couldn't just do the mathematics side or the English language side, or I think with Ridgway he had both. So this made him come across as quite slow, and I think this worried him a lot, and this also made him being bullied at school. So now we have the added pressure of, one, you can't do this work that all your friends can do at school, but now you're also being bullied for that. So the pressure, I think, on him was already building up for a young age. So he was diagnosed, I think, with an IQ of about 82, which between 70 and 80 is quite low, but I don't think in them days they would have took into his other issues. But also, I think you'll see through this case, this man's IQ means nothing. Quite an intelligent man. IQ can only tell you something about what's going on in the mind in that sort of way. But when you think about what he'd done to stop being caught and, you know, to evade the police for so long, this man was an intelligent man. He had common sense. He knew what to do. So his IQ, I think, in this case, means nothing. So from a young age, Ridgway was attracted to his mother, who was a domineering and overbearing woman. I think he said that one day she just turned around and punched the father in the face, and he literally just walked off. He was quite a placid man, and he was a bus driver along this strip, and she was the at home dominating, overbearing mother who had an influence, I think, on Ridgway's life for many years, you know, right up until his marriages. And there's a lot more about this mother to come. So Rita, his mother, often belittled him and embarrassed him for wetting the bed. Again, we've got a child now wetting the bed, which is normal at a very young age, But we are talking about now Ridgway at the age of 12 and 13, still wetting the bed. There's issues there. There's issues. You know, he was being bullied at school. He didn't fit in. He had this domineering, overbearing mother. And then he's continuing to wet the bed. And then he starts to bathe him. After he's wet the bed, she would then wash, even though he's 12 and 13, he could have took a shower himself, he could have took a bath himself. She then wanted to do that. So there's, I think, to tell you the truth, there's issues with this woman, with the mother, because there's no way that you would bathe your 12, 13-year-old son who is going through puberty, and at this time, you know, not would she just bathe him, she would wash his genital area a lot and wear quite provocative clothing while doing it, see-through nightwear, this sort of thing. So you've got this young lad now of 13 who's getting excited. It's a normal reaction for a young lad, I don't think it was what he didn't want. It was unwanted, you know. But you couldn't stop it. It's very difficult for a male to stop that sort of reaction happening. But the mother must have known this. So this now was confusing to him, because you've got this woman, you know, when you wet the bed and you're 13, and you've got this woman, your mother, that is now bathing you, washing your genitals. And this never left Ridgway, and he says this, it never left him. And then you'll get sexually excited over that of her washing your genitals, and because you're in puberty. So the mixture of signals that this boy must have been having, and then in the next breath, she's then embarrassing you and belittling you because you're wet in the bed. The mother was very strange, and I don't really know much about the mother, and I haven't really looked into her, because I think she could be another case all on her own. But anyway, you know, and I think he said, and he said it a few times in some interviews, that the faults of his mother was either sexual faults towards her, and this was throughout his life, or faults that he wanted to kill her. So again, I think this plays a big part in what's made this man become what he is. But then also you had the father, this bus driver, who was drove his bus along this strip 99, Highway 99. And this is where a lot of this, at the time, there was loads of prostitutes, loads of them, and it was a quite a big problem, you know, they were everywhere. And so this man, his father, would then come home and start to, I can't, you know, and say things like, I can't stand these prostitutes. You know, so from a young age, he had a dislike towards prostitutes, or so he says. But the father definitely did. And then you've got the father with this negative approach towards prostitutes, and you've got this domineering mother that's now washing you in provocative clothing, and you're 13. So you are completely now messed up, let alone anything else that's going on in your life. So I think because you had all this going on, and then you had Ridgway then struggling at school, and he had to repeat and repeat and repeat. So that then put pressure on him, because again, this humiliation again, not only in the home with your mother saying things, but also at school where all your friends are moving on or moving up, or the friends that you actually had, because not many people liked him. You're now being left behind. So you're now a couple of grades behind because you can't complete your work. So that again was another, and it just, I think what it did, it made him more isolated. It fueled it, because in his mind, any friend that he may have had in them groups that were moving on have now gone. All he had then was this mother who was also domineering. You know, you got this humiliation, or he felt the humiliation of being held back in school to repeat and repeat and repeat, even though he couldn't do it, and they couldn't understand why he did it, and they couldn't have done anything for him at that stage. But this, I think, added to this growing pressure within his mind. I think now at the age of 16, it becomes quite evident that there's something going on seriously within Ridgway's mind. He's now you know, the confusion and the rage. So he sees this young lad, this 6-year-old boy out, and he decides, and it was in the woods and playing, and he sees this boy and he decides that he's going to stab this boy. And he did. He stabbed him through the ribs and into his liver. It would be like to kill someone. Now this is at 16. So there was clear signs here. But again, this boy, because he survived, Ridgway, nothing was done. I don't understand it. Nothing. He didn't go away for it. He should have. He could have killed this child, this 6-year-old child, 10 years younger than he was. But these signs wasn't even picked up. So this boy is now thinking, you know, he's always wanted to kill. He's tried it his first time on this young lad. And I it's strange though that he tried first on a 6-year-old and then moved his thoughts to prostitutes. And I think what moved his thoughts to prostitutes was when he was, just before he was 18, he was, you had the Vietnam War, didn't you, going on and you know, in America, and so people were being called up. And so just before, rather than being called up and being sent here, there or everywhere, he decided that he was now going to enlist in the army. And he had also had a girlfriend at that time, and Claudia Barrows, and he married her as also just before he went to Vietnam. So he was sort of trying to change his life. But when he was in Vietnam, he slept, as he did, with prostitutes and caught gonorrhea and was fuming. He just couldn't believe it. And he took it personally that they had done this to him, you know, another blow to him. He'd got gonorrhea, you know, not that any fault of his own, but it was all their fault. So I think once he returned then from the Vietnam, he literally just then sought the company of prostitutes. So while he was overseas, Claudia cheated on him. You know, she was only young, she was 18. She hadn't really known him that long, and they'd got married quickly before he went to war, thinking, I suppose, he could die at war. But he didn't. And she cheated on him, and that infuriated him even more. So now you've gone to Vietnam, you've contracted gonorrhea, you've come back, your wife's already moved on with somebody else, left him. And that's then when he spent a lot of time in the company of prostitutes, a lot of time. And this having this STD really pissed him off. It really did. But it was this thought about, I think what Ridgway felt was about this. It was personal. You know, they give this to me. They've done this to me. And that's where I think it really turned him. So in 1973, Ridgway married Marcia Winslow. The couple had a son, Matthew. Matthew remembers his father as quite a calm person, rarely, raised his voice, went to every football game, really a loving father. And I think you could say, yes, it was. He had what I would call this mask of sanity, where you know you're living two lives, but underneath that mask is this absolute dangerous monster coming out. And at home he just had this mask of sanity, and everyone thought he was a lovely, lovely man. He was highly sexed. I think that was the issue. I think with a lot of his marriages, where once or twice a day was never enough, it was several times a day. And obviously if he couldn't get it from his wives, he was getting it from prostitutes. But you know, the son does say that he was quite calm and a loving father. So I think he also took the son on camping trips and baseball and he went to every school. Ridgway went to every school concert. He'd done everything he could, I think, for this child, to give this child a happy life. And I think it's difficult to believe, isn't it, that when we now going to look, I think, more as we get down into Ridgway, how he picked up these girls and how he killed these girls. Having a child also helped that. So was he portraying this perfect father because that's what he was? Or was he again just using the women in his life and the child in his life to give him this perfect alibi, for one, because, but also if you was getting into a car where you had toys and this nice man, a family man, and you're hitchhiking, you would believe them, wouldn't you? And sometimes his child would even be in the car. So I don't believe that he was this perfect father. To the child he was, but in his mind, this child was just there to assist, to pick up these women easier. So while Ridgway was married to Winslow, he became extremely religious, and we see this a lot with serial killers. They go through this phase, this religious phase. Do they want redemption? Probably no, because as he was going around knocking on people's door, preaching religion to others, telling them how to live their lives through religion, he was actually out then sleeping with prostitutes and doing what he was doing with prostitutes. So he was portraying one thing to them: you do this, but I'm actually doing this. And that's how Ridgway, I think, worked all his life. So the first marriage is over. She's divorced. He's now married Winslow, who was quite a heavy lady, and a nice lady, but a heavy lady. Held a lot of weight. And she then, for her own self-esteem, wanted to lose that weight, and she did. She had a gastric band fitted, and for her own sake and her health, I think, why she done it. But she lost a tremendous amount of weight and then started to look better and better. Now Ridgway didn't like this at all, because I think the reason why he married her was because he thought because she was overweight, no other man would look at her. As she then started to lose weight, and not that she was attracted to anybody else, but he thought she was, or he thought that other men would be attracted to her. This marriage then became where it was so unworkable, and that ended. He couldn't stand it. He was just this extremely jealous, and the fighting then became awful in this home again. So now that marriage is over. Now throughout these marriages, both marriages, not so much with the first one because she wasn't around too much and he was in Vietnam, but the mother continued, especially in the second marriage. So this poor woman, Winslow, she had this child that was being, not that she knew anything what was going on, but this child was being taken out and used as a ruse, I suppose, to get people into the car and stuff like that, and sometimes even be in the car and told to stay in the car while he goes off and kills these women. But also this mother, this domineering mother, this mother that, this woman that had bathed this boy from this young age, and where this man, Ridgway, still fantasized sexually about her or about murdering her, was still coming into their family home and telling the wives what to do, and told Winslow what, you're not taking care of him properly, and to lay out his clothes, what he should and shouldn't do. So this woman, no wonder this marriage ended. I don't know how she put up with it so long, but she did. But this is what this mother was like. So the mother-in-law, I suppose, was just interfering. Just absolutely interfering. And I think, so 7 years of the marriage, this couple split up, and that was that over with. And then following the divorce, Winslow claimed that Ridgway once had placed her in a chokehold during an argument. There was other things that Winslow comes up a little bit later, where she takes police to certain areas because Ridgway liked to have sex outdoors. He liked to do things outdoors. And it turns out that where he was taking Winslow, when he was married to her, to these woods and different places, was where he'd buried these bodies. So again, she thought, keep the marriage alive, you know, it was exciting, they were married, you can have sex wherever you want if you're married, even if you're not. But to take her to places where he had dead bodies were laying. Again, he's reliving this every time he goes back to these sites. He's reliving it. Now you're taking your wife, that you're so-called meant to have loved, to a site where there's buried bodies and you're having sex. He's a piece of work, this man. So despite 2 failed marriages, okay, he wasn't ready to give up and find love. Now, for me, he says he wanted to get married. I believe it was a cover story for him to be married, to be the perfect husband, to be the perfect father. This was all a cover. This was all this mask of sanity, because underneath that was totally something different, and he understood that. And so this is why I'm saying I don't think his IQ, of this low IQ, really comes into this at all. And as we go further on, you'll see why I talk like that about him. But I don't believe he loved anybody. This man is emotionless. These people in his life were a cover for his activities. So in 1985, Ridgway met Judith Mawson at a support group for single parents called Parents Without Partners. Now, there's a good thing for you, isn't it? If you're seeking someone and you're a serial killer and you're seeking someone for a cover story, someone there that you know is already been married and hasn't got a partner there, you're then going to marry her. And he was, and he did. And, you know, he had strong morals, so she thought, and you know, he loved her, or she says, oh, he loved me, and I loved him. She could not believe it when this man was arrested as a serial killer. And I don't think she's lying. I believe it. Because again, this mask of sanity on what we look at, you know, what we see is not always what's going on in here and what you're doing out there. And she also says that there wasn't times when she thought he was just disappearing or anything like that. This man was an opportunist killer. He'd kill at any point, and he was very quick at it, very good at it, and then he'd bury these bodies quite quickly, and so she wouldn't have had any reason to know, and she really was clearly shocked by the outcome, you know, when she actually found out that he really was the Green River rapist, killer. She was devastated. And now again, this mother-in-law, even in her marriage, tried to interfere, but she actually liked this Judith, because Judith was a very practical person. She paid the bills, she looked after him, she was the proper wife. So the mother sort of left her alone and left him alone, because she was doing, as far as the mother thought, what the mother would have done for him. So again, this mother plays a part in all through his life, right up, I think, until he was arrested or until she died. But you know, this mother, I think, has issues herself, and she's very controlling all the way through his life. So let's go on to the murders a little bit now. So 1982, the Green River killer was really coming into the news. You know, they had found these 2 boys were playing near the Green River and discovered a body, and it was known then as his first victim, when she was 16-year-old Wendy Caulfield. And as the summer progressed, more and more bodies were found in the river, alarming police and local residents. And there was now lots of bodies, because this man killed and killed and killed and killed in a matter of weeks. He could kill 5 or 6 a week, and he was dumping them in little packs, you know, certain areas. And now these bodies were being found. So most of the victims were killed between 1982 and 1983, and they were either prostitutes or runaways, as I've said earlier. He'd pick them up along this Pacific Highway and this International Boulevard 99. And this is also the area where his father then had drove the bus. And this was now quite an area where, you know, the prostitutes worked. And also runaways would then try and hitchhike lifts from this area. And most of his victims were all strangled. So Ridgway dumped most of his bodies in wooded areas around the Green River. With the exception of 4 victims, they were often left in clusters, or I've just said before, nude and often posed. You know, he liked to pose them. And I don't think there was any pictures taken, but he would have if he could have, I think. But at that time, just to make them nude and to pose them in a certain way, there's a reason for that. And the reason he left them in clusters is where he used to like then to return to the bodies, as many serial killers do, and then to have sex with the corpses. And you know, so they were easy to find. He could remember the story, he could remember how they died, and then he'd go back, find these bodies, and have sex with them to relive it all over again. And these women were now dead. These were now corpses. These were now deteriorating at quite a fast rate. Animals that would have got to these bodies. And he was having sex with them. So let's get back to this low IQ, because they say this a lot about serial killers. You know, some have high IQs, low IQ. It doesn't really make any difference. This man had a low IQ. But to put off investigators, he had the sense to think, I'm not going to get caught for this, because he actually enjoyed what he was doing. I am not going to get caught. I'm going to place different things around the sites from other people. He used then chewing gum, cigarettes and writing materials and stuff from other people and placed them around the site, because even though DNA, yes, was out then, this killer already knew that if they're going to catch me, or try and catch me, to have that DNA evidence, you have to have just yours, not 10 other people's. So he really thought about how to stop being caught, how to evade the police. So IQ has got nothing to do with this. This man had common sense. This man thought logically about how to evade these police and not get caught. And to tell you the truth, it took him nearly 20 years to get him. So he did a good job. It worked. He even, I think, transferred bodies across state lines, and because in them days, you know, you'd have a state, they'd look for, as I've said before, in many of these older cases, and this isn't that old, this is only in the 80s, but previously, before that, is a lot of these, especially in America, you have your state lines, and so your police officers and investigators would deal with this, but what went on the other side was then for them. So in another state, they dealt with that, and a lot of the times this didn't mix up. So it didn't come up on the computers, or in them days, well, they didn't really have that computers in them days, they're just starting to. But they didn't really talk to one another. So these cases weren't related to one another. So he really did think about it. So, you know, IQ has nothing to do with this anyway. I think one victim scratched his arm. And again, thinking, I'm going to get caught. You know, one, because her fingernails, she's scratched me with her fingernails. So he cut her fingernails before he dumped her. Then he poured like acid over his arm, so it didn't look like a scratch. It looked like more of a burn. Very sensible man. You know, he did really think about it. And I think, you know, I think this is what we have to take from someone like him, is then these people are not stupid. They think about things a lot. And then we got to think about the other thing he done was with his child. On one of the murders, he'd picked up someone. Now, if you're hitchhiking, I don't think she was a prostitute, she was a hitchhiker, this girl, runaway. Would you get in a car with someone with a child in the car and child toys in the car? Of course you would. You're not going to be worried, are you? There's a child in the car. Plus also at this time, because a lot was going on in this area, on this Green River killer, that a lot of people were asking for ID before getting in, and he'd show his ID and he'd put his thumb over the name of his ID and then show his picture and also show pictures of his child and his wife. Again, making the victim feel comfortable. I can get in this car because he's showing me his ID. Not that that ID is going to do you any good when he kills you. I don't know logically what they were thinking. But the other point is that you then have this child in the car. So you automatically think, I'm going to be safe. This is a nice man. This is a family man. This is now the picture that he wants to portray to people to make it much more easier so he can commit these crimes. And it worked. And then he took that girl. He told the boy to stay in the car. The boy was only young. Stay in the car, I'm just going to go for a walk. And he raped and murdered that girl, got back into that car and drove off like nothing had happened. Now that is the mindset of Gary Ridgway. And this is what makes him one of the most prolific serial killers of all time in America. So look, frustrations grew with this in the early 80s, where the police were growing frustrated. I think they had spent years on this, trying to find this killer. As I said, nearly 20 years. And they had took DNA, they took specimens from everything, even specimens of feces from animals. They're thinking that there could be some DNA, thinking that the victim could have been eaten by DNA, and that because these girls were going missing and no one could find them. A lot of these girls, I've said before, took 6 years to find. There was many girls going missing at this time, and this investigation, it wasn't because of police lack of trying. They tried everything to find this person, and he was interviewed a few times, but again got away with it. It's very clever, very clever. And I think in the end they got him on DNA, and they got him on the paint, because he was a paint sprayer, a car paint sprayer, and he had been that for 30 years. So he'd held down a job for 30 years, which was unusual for a serial killer, but he did. Again, this was part of his, how can I say it? It's part of his, look at his outside life to people. I'm this perfect husband, perfect man. I've had a full-time job for 30 years. Not what you would expect from someone who is such a prolific serial killer. And he evaded the police quite a lot, many times. But, and I think at some point, this investigation and this task force that they set up for this investigation, the Green River Task Force, was costing around $2 million per year. So it's not like they didn't put every effort into this, everything into this to get them. I mean, they even had Ted Bundy write them a letter and saying, I can help you, because Ted Bundy, actually, the serial killer, worked in the same area as him, and he was already in prison on death row, and he wanted to help. Now, serial killers don't help. There's usually something in it for them. He was about to his sentence was about to be done. He was going to be executed, and I think he was trying to prolong that out there. And also, Ted Bundy loved the fame. He loved it. He was at one point one of the biggest serial killers in American history, and he portrayed this image of being this perfect man, good looking, charismatic, but again, this mask of sanity, because underneath here was a terrible serial killer as well. But I think with serial killers, when a serial killer wants to give you help, there's always an ulterior motive, and there was with Bundy. But I think that the police officer that interviewed him, because you have to go, you couldn't not, go to see Ted Bundy if he tells you that he thinks he can help you catch this killer. They had to try every avenue. And I think in these interviews, Ted Bundy didn't really say about what Gary Ridgway, but it gave him an insight into the mind of a serial killer. And also, I think with what Bundy did was talk about a lot of the killings that he had done, that in the bodies that they hadn't found of them women. it was like talking in the third person. So anyway, it's a very interesting interview, but I don't think it helped solve this case. What it did is just help the officers understand the mind of a killer. And because Bundy was a killer, but also Bundy just loved the centre of attention, and it was all about him. And he was a bit pissed off that you had this Gary Ridgway taking his limelight. Because now Gary Ridgway had done more murders than Bundy would have ever have done. So anyway, that's sort of, and anyway, they did catch him. They caught him then with this DNA on, and it's about the paint flecks that matched to where he was spraying, and other DNA left at certain crime scenes. So they did get him. They did get him for that. So when they was interviewing him and talking about him, Gary was unwilling, to say that he had sex with these corpses. He said, well, I only had sex with the corpses because, it was hard for me to go out and kill someone else. Well, no, there were still many, many prostitutes on there. He tried to back away from that. He didn't want to be known as that. Well, that's what he is, necrophiliac. He was, and he did. So he was killing them and raping them while they was alive, but also then going back, finding these bodies, after quite a few weeks, and then sleeping with them. But he didn't want to be known that. He wanted that, to sort of be discarded, and that won't be. So this is a sadistic killer, and he did benefit financially, and also he says about it because he wanted to sleep with these prostitutes, but he didn't want to pay for it. He wasn't going to give her any money at all. So for him, he was getting the best of both worlds. He was getting the sex that he needed because he was a high sex drive, and then not having to pay for it. He was just killing them, and then he would return to them bodies and sleep with them anyway, and that's the mindset of him. So on December the 5th, 2001, Gary Ridgway was formally charged with the murders of 4 women. So these are the bodies that they could find. November 2003, which Ridgway accepted a plea agreement preventing him from being put to death. Now, we have this a lot, don't we, with serial killers. They find it so easy to take people's lives, but when it comes to theirs to be ended, they don't like it. Now, the reason the police, I think, had to do a plea agreement, and also the families, a lot of the families, not all the families agreed to it, but most of the families agreed, because they wanted to find these bodies. And as I always say, bodies need to be returned. It gives a closure to that family. And also then the victims can be put to rest. So I think the police had to do a deal with this man. They had to. They had no option. They would never have found these bodies. And I think now, I think he got over 400 years in prison. This man's never going to get out. So, and sometimes I think the death penalty, sometimes I think it's better to keep them in prison because you think they're going to have a harder time. They're going to actually have to live, be locked up, and know what it's like, to have lost, to have their liberty taken away. But for some of the families, they wasn't happy with that. And I think that's why the court allowed them to do a victim statements, really, about how they feel and how it made them feel. And I think that's a really good thing, because these people needed to have their say. They needed to be able to speak to this Gary Ridgway in court and tell them how that affected them. So the victim impact statements are really, really important. But I don't think the judge needed any other reason than to give this man, over, I think, 416 years in prison. And more actually on top, because since then there has been a few other victims found, and he's been given life sentences for them as well. So, he's in prison and he ain't getting out. So I think when he was arrested, he'd done certain interviews and stuff, and there's so much actually out there on, they took so many hours of interview with this man. He did say that he hated most prostitutes and didn't want to pay them for sex, as I've said before. He also picked up prostitutes as victims because they were easy to pick up. And he says, well, he was doing the job of the police because, he was clearing the streets for them. Now, I suppose that then brings us on, doesn't it, to the police again, because as we see with a lot of these serial killers, have also wanted to be police officers. Now again, another serial killer that now applied, this is when all this was going on, applied to be a police officer, but they wouldn't take him. Thank God, because he'd never have been caught. He would have well covered his tracks. So again, you know, this mentality of this man, I'm killing these people because one, I didn't want to pay for it, and also I didn't like them, and also that I'm helping you, I'm clearing your streets, I'm doing your job. Absolute ridiculous. He's just a serial killer. He done it because he could, and that's what he wanted to do, and he done it because he found these victims, what he says, easy to pick up. He manipulated and used the wives and the children, a child in his life, to make it easier to pick these victims up and to murder them. So he's definitely a terrible, terrible man. So there's about 20, I think, of Ridgway's victims' families took to the stand to confront this man, and you know, he's cold-faced as always, but one man gets up there, Robert Rule, the father of Linda Rule, one of his victims. She was just 16 when she was killed by Ridgway, and he said about forgiveness that, you know, and I think it's true in what he says, you can't go through life hating people, because in the end they win. So I think what he said was, I forgive you. And I think then they said, you know, you can see that Ridgway cries a little bit. But what you've got to think about Ridgway is emotionless. There is no emotion. There is no empathy. There is no care. This was another act for me. You know, or he was crying for himself, for his loss of his life, for his loss because he won't be able to do this again. But it certainly wasn't for the victims, and it certainly wasn't for this young girl that he murdered. It certainly wasn't. Linda Rule meant nothing to him. He said he'd killed that many. One, he didn't even know their name, he didn't even care, and he couldn't even remember half their faces. So this was just another act in his life. So in February the 17th, 2011, Ridgway confessed to the murders of Rebecca Marrero, bringing the total of confessions to 49, and since then that's even gone up now to 52. There are more.
Gary Ridgway killed so many women it took nearly an hour to read all the charges.
I strangled Cynthia Hines to death. Is that your statement, Mr. Ridgway?
Yes, it is.
Is it true?
Yes.
One at a time, Ridgway admitted killing 48 women, usually dumping their bodies in the Green River near Seattle.
I strangled Opal Mills to death. Dolores L. Williams. I strangled Deborah Estes to death.
Yes.
There were nearly 100 relatives in court. They wept as the prosecutor read Ridgway's written confession.
I killed so many women, I have a hard time keeping them straight. I wanted to kill as many women I thought were prostitutes as I possibly could. Is that true?
Yes.
I picked prostitutes because I thought I could kill as many of them as I wanted without getting caught.
He received another life sentence for that, so you know he shouldn't be out. And then he was sent. So it was because it was all concurrent. It was all adding up. And then he was sent to Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, Washington, home state. But since then, he has been moved, I think, to Colorado, because, you know, he found this prison very difficult. They didn't like him there. And I think we'll have to end this case on this, because you have a man that probably killed up to 80 women, innocent victims, prostitutes, runaways, young girls, I think 16, 15, 16, the youngest victims, people with families, people with lives, people that cared about them, for your own sake, for your own need, you've done this. And yet you go to prison and you get these 400, 500 years or whatever he's got now in prison. And you don't like it. You don't like it because the inmates don't like you. So now what they've done, they put him on a private jet and they've flown him now for his own protection to a more easier prison in Colorado, where he is now mixing with the general population of the prison and having a whale of a time. Now, you know, there are some of these investigators that have said on here, they cannot believe it, that this man can do this and then be treated in this way, where his victims, and some are still not been found, and some will probably never be found. You've still got these families grieving, and you've got this man now living life, you know, because he couldn't handle the other prison, into this nicer prison. No, there shouldn't be no nicer prison for Gary Ridgway at all. He should be suffering in a prison 23 hours a day and allowed 1 hour a day exercise. That's most of it. Now, usually in America, their sentences sometimes shock me, you know, because of the sentences that they have and that we have are totally different, you know, in this country. In England, are totally different from America. But this has shocked me. This case, but yes, they have given him all these years and he deserves it, because he'll never ever get out. There's never any chance of parole. But then you've made his life easier. And for the American prison system, I can't understand that. So anyway, enough about my ranting. This has been the case of Gary Ridgway, a prolific serial killer from the United States of America. And I can't name all his victims because there's too many. So I have done a slide at the end with all their names on it, all of them. So I hope you think that's okay. And I'm sorry that I couldn't mention everyone. If I had to mention everyone and everything about this case, we would be here forever. So I'm very sorry, but that's what I've had to do, is put a slide on with all the names. And it's a full slide of names of the victims. So you know what to do. You can follow us on Facebook and on Instagram. You can hit the like button down there, thumbs up. You can click on that subscribe logo that Lacey puts up there. So thank you for watching this video. And until the next time, bye bye.